Have you ever noticed how some people seem impossible to hold on to? Just when things start to feel close, they vanish, they stop calling, they take longer to reply. It's like the closer you step, the further they run. And no matter how hard you try to bridge the gap, it feels like you're chasing shadows. But here's the twist. There's one kind of person they can't outrun. One person who doesn't need to chase, doesn't need to beg, and doesn't need to play games. This person stands so firmly in their own strength, so steady in who they are, that even the most avoidant person, the one who can slip through anyone else's fingers, can't escape them. That person is what I call the super empath. You know, people often talk about the avoidant like they're a magician, slipping through cracks, dodging intimacy, pulling the disappearing act right when you start to get close. But there's one kind of person they can't escape, not because this person chases harder, but because they don't chase at all. This person is what I like to call the super empath. See, a super empath has radar. They can read the room. They pick up on every subtle shift in tone, body language, or silence. They understand what's being said and what's being avoided. And because of that, the avoidant can't run the usual playbook on them. When someone with avoidant tendencies pulls away, the natural instinct for most people is to immediately assume it's about them. They replay conversations in their head, wondering what they said wrong. They analyze every text, every emoji, every pause, like detectives on a crime scene. The anxious part of us wants to grab onto certainty, and when we don't have it, we create stories to fill the gaps. Maybe I'm too much. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I'm not enough. That cycle is exhausting, and it plays right into the avoidance dynamic because the more you spiral, the more they feel validated in pulling away. The super empath, however, operates differently. When they sense distance, they don't leap to self-blame. They don't put themselves under a microscope as if their worth is on trial. Instead, they recognize a simple truth: avoidance isn't a verdict on them. It's a reflection of the other person's internal world. It's fear wearing the mask of detachment. It's someone protecting themselves from intimacy because closeness feels threatening. The super empath knows this instinctively, and that knowing allows them to keep their balance when someone else starts retreating. This doesn't mean the super empath doesn't care. In fact, they care deeply. But their empathy gives them perspective. They can see that distance is not necessarily rejection. It's a coping mechanism. And because they don't internalize the pullback, they don't react with desperation. Where most people might frantically send long texts, try to fix things, or chase after reassurance, the super empath simply observes, okay, you need space. That's not about me. I'll respect it, and I'll continue being me. That level of composure is powerful because it doesn't feed the avoidance fear. It doesn't escalate the tension. Think about how different that energy feels. Imagine one person who immediately panics, pleads, or demands answers. That energy can feel suffocating to someone already afraid of closeness. Now picture the super empath, steady, calm, unmoved by the storm. They don't punish, they don't cling, and they don't collapse into self-doubt. Instead, they stay grounded in their own value, knowing that whether the avoidant chooses to come closer or stay away, their worth doesn't fluctuate. That's why the avoidant can't escape so easily, because they can't manipulate the super empath into the typical dance of push and pull. And here's where it gets even more interesting. When the avoidant sees that their withdrawal doesn't cause chaos, it unsettles them. The usual script doesn't work. The super empath isn't baited into over-explaining or begging for connection. They aren't destabilized by distance. Instead, they create a kind of emotional mirror that quietly reflects back. Your fear is yours. I'm not here to solve it for you, and I won't let it define me. In that space, the avoidant has to face themselves. They can't use the other person's reaction as proof that closeness is dangerous, because the super empath responds with calm strength instead of panic. That's why not taking it personally is such a superpower. It disrupts the cycle completely. The super empath's refusal to interpret avoidance as a personal failure robs it of its power. It stops the chase. It stops the self-doubt. It stops the avoidant from running the same old script. And when the usual script doesn't work, everything changes. When an avoidant pulls back, the temptation for most people is either to chase harder or to retreat completely. It becomes a game of extremes. One person is pulling away, the other either clings on tighter or vanishes altogether. But a super empath operates differently. They have this remarkable ability to mirror without mimicking. When the avoidant steps back, they don't charge forward in panic, but they also don't collapse into disappearance. Instead, they reflect a balanced energy. I respect your need for space, but I remain present in my own groundedness. This balance is subtle yet incredibly powerful. Think about it: when someone withdraws and you chase, you reinforce their fear that closeness equals pressure. But if you vanish completely, you confirm their fear that intimacy means abandonment. Either way, you're playing into the avoidance cycle. What makes the super empath different is their ability to show, I'm not here to smother you, but I'm also not going to dissolve because you're uncomfortable. That kind of consistency disarms the avoidant because it doesn't fit the narrative they're used to. The key here is presence. The super empath can maintain their life, their joy, their rhythm, even while giving space. They don't send a flood of texts demanding reassurance, but they also don't punish with silence or icy withdrawal. Instead, they carry on being themselves in a way that communicates, my world doesn't collapse because you've stepped back. That quiet strength makes the avoidant realize that their distancing tactics don't destabilize the relationship in the usual way. This creates a new dynamic. The avoidant may take space, but the super empath's calm presence reminds them that the bond still exists without pressure. It's a safe kind of closeness, one that respects boundaries but doesn't surrender connection. This is very different from the desperate pull or the cold pushback they're accustomed to. It unsettles their usual pattern because it shows that intimacy doesn't have to feel suffocating and independence doesn't have to mean isolation. It's also important to note that mirroring without mimicking requires emotional discipline. Many people, when faced with distance, will unconsciously copy it, thinking, if you don't text me, I won't text you either. But that's not strength, that's retaliation. The super empath doesn't engage in emotional games. Their mirroring is not a strategy to manipulate, it's a reflection of their groundedness. They're able to hold space without collapsing into bitterness or resentment. And that difference is everything. Imagine how that feels to the avoidant. They retreat expecting panic or punishment. Instead, they find calm acceptance. The super empath isn't chasing, but they're also not disappearing. They're simply holding their place in the world with dignity, warmth, and steadiness. This unsettles the avoidant's old narrative that closeness is always overwhelming or that people can't be trusted to stay. For the first time, they experience someone who doesn't push or punish, but instead creates a steady rhythm of connection that doesn't break under pressure. That's why the avoidant can't escape this dynamic. The super empath doesn't make distance into a drama. They reflect it back with respect, but they don't mirror the fear behind it. Their presence becomes undeniable, not because they force it, but because it exists with quiet strength. And in that space, the avoidant feels something they don't usually feel: safety in closeness, freedom in connection, and a new possibility that intimacy doesn't have to cost them their independence. Silence is one of the avoidant's most reliable tools. It's their shield, their comfort zone, their way of saying, I need space, without having to use words that expose vulnerability. To most people, silence feels unbearable. It creates anxiety, makes the mind spiral, and often triggers a frantic need to fill the void with messages, calls, or explanations. That's why silence works so well as a defense. It pushes others into overcompensating, which reinforces the avoidant's fear that intimacy will always demand too much. But the super empath has a very different relationship with silence. They don't crumble in it. They don't rush to fill the gap. They know how to sit in the quiet without losing their balance. This is powerful because silence, when left unchallenged, is meant to create control. It says, I'll withhold my presence until you bend, until you react, until you show me that I have the upper hand. Most people take that bait immediately, sending long, vulnerable paragraphs or apologizing for things they didn't even do. The super empath, however, sees through it. They recognize silence as a coping mechanism, not a judgment on their worth. So instead of chasing, they stay calm. They don't engage in a power struggle. Their stillness says, I can be comfortable here. I don't need constant noise to know who I am. The avoidant expects their silence to create chaos. They expect the other person to crumble under the weight of not knowing. But when faced with someone who doesn't react that way, it becomes unsettling. The super empath can remain present without pushing, patient without collapsing, and grounded without resentment. They can even use silence as a mirror, gently reflecting back the truth. You can retreat, but I don't disappear in the absence of your voice. That subtle confidence shifts the entire dynamic. Think of how it feels when someone doesn't demand anything from you in your silence. They don't pressure, they don't plead, and they don't punish. Instead, they hold space with quiet strength. That is what makes the avoidant notice them differently. Silence, in this context, loses its edge as a weapon. It no longer controls the dynamic. Instead, it becomes a neutral space in which both people can exist. For the avoidant, that's rare because silence is usually the one tool they can always rely on to regain control. The super empath also knows how to listen beneath the silence. They understand that withdrawal is often a language of fear, not indifference. So they can approach it without panic, without hostility, and without trying to force connection. This doesn't mean they accept neglect or tolerate emotional absence forever. What it means is they don't let silence define them or dictate their sense of security. They use it as information, as a signal, but never as proof of their inadequacy. This ability makes them unshakable. They don't beg for attention, and they don't shut down to retaliate. They let silence exist without giving it the power to destabilize them. And in that space, the avoidant finds something they don't expect. Someone who isn't trying to win the game, but someone who quietly refuses to play it. That presence is impossible to escape, not because it's forceful, but because it's steady in the very place most people falter. Loving with boundaries is one of the most misunderstood strengths in relationships. Many people think love means unconditional tolerance, giving endlessly, forgiving endlessly, and holding space no matter what the other person does. But true love without boundaries quickly turns into self-abandonment. That's why the super empath stands out so powerfully. They don't confuse compassion with compliance. They can love deeply while still drawing clear lines around what they will and won't accept. And this combination is precisely what disarms the avoidant because it's a balance they rarely encounter. An avoidant thrives when the dynamic tilts too far in one direction. If someone has no boundaries, the avoidant assumes they can control the pace of the connection entirely. They can dictate closeness, disappear at will, and still be met with forgiveness and availability. On the other hand, if someone's boundaries are rigid walls with no warmth, the avoidant feels justified in retreating further, claiming that intimacy is suffocating or hostile. But the super empath disrupts that cycle. They show love generously through kindness, attention, and emotional openness, while at the same time calmly saying, "This is where I draw the line." For example, when an avoidant pulls away, the super empath doesn't punish them, but they also don't chase endlessly. If communication becomes inconsistent, they don't collapse into neediness or accept crumbs as enough. Instead, they communicate their needs clearly. "I respect your space, but I also need consistency to feel safe." That boundary isn't an attack, it's simply a truth. The avoidant is forced to recognize that while the super empath offers love, it's not unconditional in the sense of tolerating neglect. The love is deep, but it's not without standards. This balance is magnetic because it communicates self-respect. The super empath isn't staying out of fear of being alone. They're choosing to stay as long as the connection is healthy. That energy feels different. It creates a sense of security, but also a challenge. The avoidant can no longer coast on their usual patterns. They're faced with someone who both accepts them and holds them accountable. For someone used to escaping whenever intimacy feels overwhelming, this is a new and confronting experience. Boundaries also allow the super empath to maintain their identity within the relationship. They don't disappear into the other person's moods, silences, or fears. They remain themselves, loving, but not lost. This means the avoidant can't simply retreat into distance and expect the empath to dissolve into waiting. Instead, the super empath continues to live, to grow, to thrive, all while maintaining a steady presence. That duality, "I love you, but I will not shrink for you," is what creates a dynamic that's impossible to escape. At its core, loving with boundaries sends one powerful message: "I can care for you deeply without abandoning myself." And that message dismantles the avoidance script. Because for perhaps the first time, they encounter someone who loves in a way that feels safe and free, yet refuses to sacrifice self-respect in the process. That mix of warmth and strength is the exact balance the avoidant doesn't know how to run from. One of the most remarkable things about the super empath is their ability to bring truth to the surface without doing it in a way that feels like an attack. Most people, when they feel ignored, dismissed, or pushed away by an avoidant, lash out. They get angry, they demand answers, or they accuse. "Why are you always so distant? Why don't you ever open up?" while the frustration is understandable, that approach almost always backfires. An avoidant, when confronted aggressively, doesn't lean in, they shut down even more. They retreat further behind their walls because the intensity reinforces their fear of intimacy. The super empath understands this dynamic, so they approach exposure differently. Instead of harsh confrontation, they shine a quiet, steady light. They name what's happening without blame. They might say something like, "I notice that when things start to feel closer, you sometimes take a step back. Is that what's happening here?" This simple, calm acknowledgement does something extraordinary. It reveals the avoidance behavior in a way that's undeniable yet not shaming. It doesn't accuse, it observes. An observation without hostility has a disarming effect. It makes the avoidant feel seen rather than judged. For someone who has spent most of their life hiding from closeness, being seen with gentleness instead of criticism is both terrifying and magnetic. This ability to expose without attacking is rooted in the super empath's emotional intelligence. They know that real connection doesn't come from winning arguments or proving a point. It comes from creating a space where the other person can actually hear what's being said without feeling like they're under fire. That's why their approach works where others fail. They reveal patterns with compassion. They hold up a mirror that says, "This is what I see. What do you see?" That invitation to reflect is very different from an accusation, and it's what makes the avoidant pause instead of run. It also shifts the balance of power. When an avoidant is called out in anger, they can easily dismiss the other person as too needy or too dramatic. But when the super empath speaks with clarity and calmness, there's no chaos to point to, no storm to blame. The truth just hangs in the air, undeniable. The avoidant is forced to sit with it. They can't escape it by reframing the other person as unstable, because the super empath has delivered it without emotional volatility. That subtle difference makes all the difference. And perhaps the most powerful part of this approach is that it strips away the avoidant's illusion of control. Silence, withdrawal, and defensiveness usually allow them to dictate the narrative. But when the super empath speaks with both kindness and firmness, the narrative shifts. Suddenly, the avoidant isn't hiding, they're being gently illuminated. And once you've been illuminated, once someone has calmly shown you your patterns, you can't fully retreat into pretending they don't exist. That's why this ability to expose without attacking makes the super empath impossible to escape. They reveal the truth in a way that bypasses defenses and lands directly in the heart. So when we look at the dance between the avoidant and the world around them, most people get caught in the push and pull, the chasing and retreating, the endless cycle of miscommunication. But the super empath doesn't play that game. They don't chase. They don't punish. They don't collapse. Instead, they stand in their truth with calmness, with boundaries, with presence. And that's why the avoidant can't escape them, because the super empath doesn't operate from fear. They operate from strength, clarity, and love. The lesson here isn't just about avoidance. It's about all of us. How often do we mistake someone else's behavior as a reflection of our worth? How often do we overextend, over-apologize, or overcompensate just to hold on to someone who's pulling away? The super empath teaches us that real power comes from knowing who you are, standing firmly in that identity, and refusing to abandon yourself for someone else's comfort. That's the kind of presence no one can run from, not even the people most skilled at running. So if there's one thing to take away, it's this: your strength isn't in chasing someone down or in proving your value or in tolerating what hurts you. Your strength is in standing steady, in being the kind of person who can love deeply while never losing themselves. That's what makes you unforgettable. That's what makes you unshakable. That's what makes you the one who can't be escaped. Thank you for sharing this time with me today. Thank you for your energy, your attention, and your willingness to look deeper into how we connect, love, and protect ourselves in relationships. I hope you leave here not just with insights about others, but with a stronger sense of how powerful you can be when you stop shrinking, stop chasing, and start standing firmly in who you are. It's been an honor to speak with you. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and until next time, thank you.